Hello there, I'm Sean Creasley and welcome to another edition of our SQL tutorials. In this tutorial I will be briefly discussing inbuilt functions within the SQL environment. I will take a little look at dates as I mentioned in the last tutorial. Now, before we begin, what SQL can do for us is not just a query-based programming language, but it also hides a few little unique tools and techniques which are quite useful when querying tables. For example, if you wanted to display the system date in any of your tables, you can simply say select the system date. What sysdate is, it's an inbuilt function within SQL which calls the date from the local server machine wherever you're running SQL from. From Joule. Now what Joule is, it isn't a table I have just created before this tutorial. It is an inbuilt virtual table within the SQL environment. It's kind of like a special table that you can use to call various unique little functions, for example, to override syntax problems. So if we only want sysdate, it will throw an error, for example, because it wants to know where sysdate is coming from. So what Joule is, it's kind of like a special date which houses the understanding of these functions we're using. For example, if we want to use this as a little calculator, 6 times 5655, we're using the virtual table Joule to handle this equation here to display our answer of 33,930. We may want to rename this column as calculation. And as you can see, you can use a special few little tips and techniques within SQL to call certain calculations. See calculation there. So that is a little look at inbuilt functions within SQL. I'll be discussing more on data functions later, but there's a few little tips and techniques you can pick up. Okay, as briefly explained in one of the first tutorials about dates within SQL, they do work a little differently, as the syntax is as follows. This is how you write the 1st of September. You have to put September as the letter format, not the month format, or it will throw an error. So for example, if we want to perform various calculations using dates, for example, we want to display the dates of the employees who were recruited, for example, for approximately 23 years. So if we run this, as you can see, 2004 take away 23 years is about 1982. So it should cut out that one of the latter thing, and maybe 82. So for example, we can say select every field from the employee table, where we're using the hire date here, where the hire date plus, for the purpose of the example, I'm skipping out leap years and assuming every year has 365 days. So we can say times 23 years. So hire date, where the hire date plus 23 days. What we're doing here, we're adding the number of days, because 365 days times 23 years, we're getting the total number of days an employee has worked. When you're using constraints against dates within SQL, it looks to compare it in terms of dates. So if you say where the system date take away the hire date is more than 23 for 23 years, it's going to assume that 23 is the number of days. So we do need to get this in terms of days. So where the hire date plus 23 years as the format of that is less than sysdate. I think that should solve this. So these are the employees that have been working for the company for 23 years. There's one way of doing it. You could say where the system date minus the hire date is more than this number of days, which is 23 years. So that is how to play around with dates within SQL. We have to convert it into days then perform calculations as necessary. So, this has been Sean Greasley. Thank you for listening to another edition of the SQL tutorials, and goodbye.